everybody, to another episode of the In All Kinds of Weather Forecast. I'm your host, Chris Yanes, joined alongside my co-host, Neil Schulman. And tonight we have an awesome guest, Allie Peak-Wilbur. She is joining us here to preview the upcoming season for the Florida Gators. And I'm sure we'll probably get into a little bit of talk about the recent documentary that just dropped today. So happy Netflix drop day for the Florida Gators. But Allie, welcome on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. This is super fun. I'm excited.
Yeah, and I know we're all pretty excited to finally actually have a season. We are, 9 days away now from kicking it off against Utah. So the excitement, I think, is finally starting to set in. But before we get all to that, we love to do a lightning round with our guests to kind of get to know them. So 4 quick questions here. We'll start off with first, your favorite Gator moment to watch. So this could be in person, this could be not in person, whatever it may be. I'm sure you have a great library of memories, but would love to hear your favorite.
Yeah, I mean, goodness, there's so many of them. Probably watching my husband and my brother win national championships are 2 moments that are core memories for me. And then Jarvis Moss blocking the extra point against South Carolina, the field goal against South Carolina, was a huge one. He was Eric's roommate at the time. And so that was a really neat moment for me. He let my 7-year-old brother smoke a cigar after that game to celebrate. There's a lot of really good memories. So, but those are probably 3 that stand out.
That's awesome. So would you say that the block kick in the swamp was probably your favorite memory that you can think of?
Obviously them winning championships is huge. Eric with the punt in the SEC championship game against Arkansas, where Wandy Pierre-Louis recovers it in the end zone. Like, that was huge. There's kind of there was a fake punt that happened, right before that, which there's kind of a story there because Eric told Meyer, like, do you have any balls? If you do, you'll call a fake here. And then so we called a fake because he was challenged there.
So, all right, trivia. I'll be impressed if you get this. Do you remember the Arkansas punt returner's name who fumbled?
Reggie Fish.
Yes. Very nice.
I can tell you because Eric played in the CFL on the same team as Reggie Fish a few years later.
Wow.
But yes, Reggie Fish, who's like 5 inches shorter than me.
And he broke the cardinal rule that you do not pedal backward from the 10-yard line.
Never go backwards.
Especially not when your heels are inside the 10-yard line.
Definitely. So, and certainly not when you were looking at the gunners that they were looking at. So
yeah, there was a ton of speed on that team. And I do remember that moment when the fake was called because that game was interesting. Like, we had all the momentum in the first half. I think we got up like 17-0 on them. And you just felt like, okay, this was our night. We had a lot of close calls in 2006, a lot of close games. But that one, in the first half, you thought, okay, we're going to cruise to an SEC championship. And then it just felt like we lost it all.
Never going to be that easy for Florida.
Yeah, not that team.
Not that. I mean, I just think the way that Florida has won national championships in 96, in 2006, in 2008, it always required a little bit of magic. We are just not the program that gets the easy 12-0 and walks into it. We're not. Like, there's always a scrappiness to the team. There's always a little bit of magic. That 2006 team had it. I can remember being in the stadium, and that was before Twitter was a thing. Facebook was just college students. So you didn't have as much information right at your hands on your phone, but it went up on the Jumbotron that UCLA had beaten USC. And so you're watching that like in real time, essentially, like kind of make its way around the stadium. And then you're watching the players on the field getting the information too, and like tapping each other on the shoulders and looking. And I can remember what that felt like. We knew, okay, if we can figure out a way to close this out, we have a good chance of going to the national championship game. And that, I can remember that like it was yesterday.
Yeah. Do you think that when it started trickling down from the stands to the players, that might have got in their psyche a little bit, and that's when the game kind of like turned a little bit in Arkansas's favor?
Meyer turned it on at halftime in the locker room, which is definitely not something that he would normally do, but he wanted them to know that they were playing for all the marbles, essentially. Like, if they could finish there, they were going to have a great chance to play the national championship game. And then, Urban is such a politician. He did such a great job petitioning for why Florida should be there. And Lloyd Carr probably made maybe the biggest mistake of his coaching career, refusing to say why Michigan. belonged. And I don't know how much the BCS took, how much that was taken into consideration or not, or whatever, but Urban went to bat for them. And, obviously we saw the results.
Yeah, no doubt. And that started the string of SEC teams that won a national championship. And ever since 2006, the majority of teams that have won a title outside of the state of Ohio have been from the South. So it was a pretty big turning point for college football that night.
Yeah, I mean, it is the SEC dominance that we see now started with that team, which is, pretty cool. I always remind Eric, you guys did this. You started this, and it really, Urban revolutionized the conference that year. I think that, nobody knew what to do with the spread, right? And we've seen this time and time again in not only the SEC, but college football in general. Spurrier did it at Florida with the fun and gun. He was, coming into a conference where it was a run first, very vanilla, strong defense, type of football being played. And so he revolutionized it. And then I think eventually everybody adapted. And when Meyer came, the spread happened. And we've since changed, now from where we are now, but he changed college football that year.
Yeah, no doubt. And hopefully we'll be changing college football once again under the Billy Napier era, which we'll get into a little bit later in the show. But thank you for that, Allie. Now let's switch gears a little bit. Next question is, what is your favorite uniform combo? And this is turned into a little bit of a controversial question for the fan base. Like everybody, you have your traditionalists out there like myself. You have the fans out there like Neil that really love the alternates. Where do you stand on that debate?
I'm not a fan of the alternates. If Alabama wouldn't do it, I don't want to do it, kind of thing. I like the traditional uniforms. I'm a Blues girl. Give me a blue jersey, white pants. I'm happy, but I see the value in the alternate jerseys. It's a huge recruiting thing. 18-year-old kids want to wear some really cool thing that Jumpman or Nike or whatever came up with. And so from that aspect, if that's going to be the difference in us landing a kid, then wear all black. I don't care. Wear army green and look like you crawled through the mud. Whatever. I'm fine with it. I just, in general, am not a huge fan of gimmicky stuff.
Agreed. What are your thoughts on the all black now that we've officially released that for the Arkansas game later this season?
So I love the purpose for why we're doing it. I think that's really neat. We don't play that well in our alternate uniforms a lot of the time. So that kind of bothers me. An interesting thing that people don't know is that Dan Mullen pushed for black uniforms for 3 years and was turned down by our administration every single time. So I would love to know what it was that Napier finally said that flipped the switch. And I wonder if it was the charity aspect. I would love to know. But listen, it's the sign of the times. It's where we are. We have black for every other sport too. So why would we not let football have an opportunity to do it?
Napier is definitely better at the whole concept of soft power than Dan Mullen is.
I think so, but I also think our administration it kind of has revolutionized a little bit too. I think that they finally got it. I think for a very long time there was just this, thought process that we are the University of Florida. We do not need to bend to these trends in college football, whether it be black uniforms or, the NIL stuff or, the best facilities, because we are a top 10 university and obviously now a top 5 university. We have, we're in the state of Florida. We have this, we have that. That should sell itself. And I think that it took a very long time for the administration to wrap their heads around why that's not really where the sport is right now. All of those things can be true, but kids still won't pick you because of them.
Yeah, we went into that in our last pod, didn't we, Chris?
We did. And I think, what Allie's really touching on is the fact that the administration, I think, finally had a wake-up call after firing 3 consecutive head coaches since the Urban Meyer era. We're very far removed from that now, where we're getting to the point where the guys coming out of high school don't really remember that era. They have to watch a Netflix documentary to actually see what that time was all about. And Florida, like we said, revolutionized the game of college football in 2 different decades. And in a span of 10, 12 years, we won 3 national championships, and that set the standard, but you have to continue to raise the bar within your program. Otherwise, you're going to have an Alabama or a Georgia or a Clemson, Ohio State come up and knock you off your pedestal.
Yeah, and I think you have to be willing to adapt. This game has changed so much, whether or not we like it or not. And there are parts of it that the traditionalist in me hates that have changed. But the reality is, it's where we are. And the saying "change or die" is essentially the truth in college football. And I think maybe the only person that hasn't had to change at the same breakneck speed is Nick Saban, and it's essentially because he's earned that right. And because he was ahead of the curve on some things. If you look at Alabama's facilities, they've been the best for a really long time. So they were never playing catch up. And I think that we're caught up right now, but we've been playing catch up, unfortunately. And a lot of that has to do with our own choices, over the past 2 decades.
Well, we've had to do things I think as Chris calls it, or maybe it was me. One of us, I remember in the last pod, called it the F around and find out method. With something like Jaden Rashada. We had to learn it the hard way. It would have been cool if we didn't learn a lesson by losing a player like that. We could have just figured out hey, maybe if we do this, something not ideal is going to result from it. Let's maybe not do this thing. No, we had to learn it the way of F around and find out. So regardless, though, I do think Florida now, as you touched on, as I'm sure we'll talk about more on this episode, is that Florida is in a position now where I think you're going to see things be maybe a little bit more even than they were last year. There was a massive disparity at so many different parts of the field, and even the game off the field, between the Florida Gators and other schools they were competing against. I don't think that maybe you can say that gap is completely evened now, but it's headed that way. And that's the theme I think we can look forward to seeing play out this year.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that there's so much more balance in a lot of different aspects on the field, but also off of it as well. And I think we're coming from a position of strength now. And I think it took kind of a meeting of the minds from multiple levels, but we had to get the right head coach. We had to have an administration willing to make concessions for that head coach to be able to be successful. There was a lot of pieces to the puzzle. NIL had to be completely restructured. But I think that the train has left the station. It's headed in the right direction. I hope Gator fans are willing to give Billy Napier the time that he needs for a complete overhaul to be successful, because I really do think that it's possible for us.
Most definitely. So kind of on that note, talking about Billy Napier, shifting gears to the 2022 season, we talked about it last week on our show, kind of evaluating where Billy Napier is going into year 2. What grade would you assign Billy Napier 1 year in, and what it may be something that he's done really well, and then what's something he needs to improve on?
Okay, so let's see. I think I'd probably give him a B overall. I think he has recruited lights out. I would give him an A+ in recruiting. And I think that he's doing it from such a genuine place. And I think that's going to pay dividends, because regardless of how this season turns out, I think this class holds, which means no matter what the record is, I still think we will have taken a step forward, even if on paper people are like, 7-5 or whatever. Was that big of a step? If this class holds, yes, that is that big of a step. We have the second hardest strength of schedule in the country, and we will have somewhere between the third and fifth best recruiting class when it all shakes out. I think a lot of the things that I think about Billy Napier all come from the same place. I think he's genuine, and I think that is such a huge character trait, quality that you need in your head coach. We were in Gainesville on Friday. They did like a former player lunch, and then they had a scrimmage that was open to players, and Billy Napier spoke for a few minutes. And I've been alive for 8 Florida coaches. I don't really remember Galen Hall. I was very little. So we'll start with Spurrier and on. I don't know that I've ever listened to a coach speak so genuinely to a room of players and their families before. I mean, he challenged them to show up. Don't call, don't write, come. This is your home. You're allowed to be here anytime you want, wherever you want, whenever you want, with no notice. You're always welcome. We want you. And that is such a different feel than we've gotten, depending on the coach, over the last couple of decades. There's a lot of times where it's like, here, jump through these 3 hoops, spin around, and then make sure your name tag's available at all times. And this just felt so different. So I think he's earned the alumni support and, the player support. I think he's a genuine coach to his actual players. And I think he's recruiting really well. So the last piece of that puzzle in my mind is going to be the on the field play. And I think for me, I'm really interested to watch offensive play calling. I feel like there were some head scratchers last year. I find it an interesting choice to have, 3 pieces of Billy Napier's army that'll hold your coffee, but you're going to call the plays and you're going to handle special teams and you're going to also work with the quarterbacks. That seems a little bit unbalanced to me, but maybe it's going to work. But that's going to be an area that I'm interested to see if there's improvement on. How self-reflective is Billy Napier? Is he able to look at film from last year and be like, man, I didn't do a great job in this game on this play or this. Let's come up with a way to do it better the next time. And then I'm interested to see what changes have happened on defense. I think we're faster. I know we're bigger. I know we've got guys that are bought in, but the defense has to improve from where it was last year, or we're going to end up with a similar record. So those are the areas that I'm watching, but I would say probably a B overall. And that's mainly because the on the field play has to improve.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a lot of points that Neil said that he felt that he deserves an A+ in recruiting, but the on-field probably is around a C, and that's where I think Neil and I both landed. I think Neil had him at a B+, I had him at a B+. But yeah, I would agree. Like the on-field results ultimately have to show. You can be the nicest guy in the world, but it doesn't matter if it's a wins and loss game. And if the wins don't eventually come, then people start asking questions and accountability has to be had.
Yeah. And I think he's in a not awesome position because we do have such a difficult schedule this year. And then next year when divisions are gone and it is insanely, competitive, he's going to be in a position where, and best case scenario is Mertz is serviceable or better than serviceable this year. And he can start again next year because it would be really difficult for a year 3 Billy Napier to have to start DJ Lagway week 1 against that schedule. That is in a do or die year for Napier, potentially. So if that scenario could be avoided for Napier, I would love that. But I think people have to be patient. I think this year, as long as Florida gets 6 wins or better, I think it's an improvement. The schedule is hard. We are in the middle of a rebuild. After that, we play the hardest schedule in the entire country. So I think you've got to give him 4 years. And I think that's, unless the wheels completely fall off and he's, riding down university on a moped with a co-ed on his back or something, like you've got to give him at least those 4 years to see if he can figure it out.
Well, that didn't stop Hugh Freeze from coaching in the SEC, but that's one of the things you just said is something that I gotta push back on a little bit because I hear everyone say the same thing, that 2024 schedule is brutal. Well, yeah, but isn't it for everyone? Like you're in the SEC. Yes. I don't see Alabama. I don't see a Hugh Freeze coached Auburn there. I don't see Oklahoma, who, yes, I know they're not what they were with Lincoln Riley, but that's still a premier program. LSU's at home. Texas A&M was going to be one of the more talented teams you face at home. It could have been so much worse than it was.
Yeah, it could have. When I say the hardest strength of schedule, I'm referencing articles that I've seen that literally rank it as the hardest schedule in the country for next year. But you're right. Everybody has a hard schedule in the SEC. It just is a very inopportune moment for it to be year 3 and have, all eyes on you, because that's usually what Florida has done is this 3-year kind of look back. But you're right, that everybody is going to play a tough schedule, and Florida has always played a tough schedule. And part of why it looks so tough is because Florida hasn't taken care of business the last several years. A schedule, and this year is the same way. We're looking at it saying like, oh man, Kentucky's beaten us before. We beat South Carolina last time, but South Carolina's on the rise. We're looking at Tennessee. The Florida that we know, none of those should be a problem. The Florida that we know should look at this year's schedule and be like, all right, well, we for sure see 10 wins, and then we're going to be battling with Georgia and we're going to be battling with LSU. But, if we go 1-1 on those, we'll be happy. Yeah. But it's because we've dropped the ball the last few years that these schedules do feel so daunting.
Yeah, Neil, and we've talked about it ad nauseum. We cannot become the elite of the SEC again until we start taking care of the teams we beat year in and year out.
You have to win the games you're supposed to.
It's the Greg McElroy quote, and you know what? He used it for Dan Mullen, but I think it was in 2018 or pre-2018. But it's applicable now. at Florida, don't worry about Alabama. Don't worry about LSU. Don't worry about Georgia. Don't worry about FSU, who at that time had beaten us 5 years in a row. You worry about Kentucky, who's given you struggles left and right. They hadn't beaten us at that point, but 17, they should have beaten us. 15, 14, they probably should have beaten us. Worry about Kentucky. You worry about Vandy, who not that long ago beat you. It was, I think, 4 years prior at that point. You worry about a team like South Carolina, who had just beaten Florida the year before. So Florida can't worry about Georgia. It's just as true now because Georgia, yes, the gap is closing a little bit, but you can't worry about teams 4 or 5 runs ahead of you when you are struggling to beat these teams that are supposedly inferior to you. And Chris, I mean, we'll talk about that soon, but I mean, we have a lot of those on our schedule this year. We do. It's not that unfathomable to think that Florida could run off a bunch of wins to start the year. It's not that insane to think that.
Well, there's so many coin flip games. And last year there was a lot of coin flip games too. And there's some that we could have won. We look back, but we also won a couple we could have lost. Utah was a coin flip game. Honestly, USF was a coin flip game. For all the coin flip games we lost last year, the season honestly could have been even worse because we did win some, but you've got to win all the coin flip games or most of the coin flip games. And you've got to win the games that you're supposed to win. You are supposed to beat Kentucky. I saw a stat this week. I think Kentucky has beaten Florida in Gainesville twice in the last 51 attempts. I got to double check because
I've been at both of them. I was in the swamp for both of them and have not seen them beat Kentucky yet. That's just astonishing to me.
I mean, but Kentucky has our number right now. Vanderbilt, Florida consistently plays down to Vanderbilt. Missouri has given Florida fits over the past, 10 years. Florida has got to take care of the teams that we say we're better than. Recruiting stats say we're better than. Records overall say we're better than. But for some reason, when we kick off, we play to where they are. And that is the first problem to fix. You're right. Before we worry about what Georgia's doing or LSU is doing, or even Florida State is doing.
I'm very glad you brought up that line of teams we should beat and coin flips. Put a pin in that because Chris, we're gonna finish the show with that. You're gonna hear that line again. That's very, very impressive that you're able to read my mind like that.
Yep. So we look at Napier, we look at where this team's headed. Let's now break down the position groups. And we'll start with the quarterback because I think that probably when back in December, when we realized Anthony Richardson was not going to be returning, he went on to the NFL and this week was named the starting quarterback of the Colts. So obviously he made a good move on his part, but that left a void to fill. And then in comes Graham Mertz, who I think for many months was very controversial in the take. I think a lot of fans wish we would have gone a different direction there in the transfer portal. Obviously, we wish that we maybe even had Jaden Rashada, but none of that came to fruition. Graham Mertz is our starting quarterback, but he's played very well in fall camp and the scrimmages, and the team really seems to be rallying around him as their leader. So what do you think of the quarterback position going into this season and kind of just evaluate that situation as a whole?
So first of all, there was not a ton of talent in the transfer portal. So when Florida had to go in there and get one, there's not a whole lot of options to choose from, right? So, and Graham Mertz has started the most number of games of anybody that was in there. So obviously Napier has said ad nauseum that that's one of the things that he took into consideration. But I just don't think we need him to be awesome. I think we need him to be a game manager. I think we need him to not make mistakes. I think that there is enough talent, particularly obviously in the running backs room, but I think the offensive line is good enough. There is enough young wide receiver talent that Florida can put together an efficient offense. Now, I don't think they're getting into, gunslinging battles with teams and coming out victorious, right? But I think that if they can get an efficient offense that eats the clock and relies heavily on the running game, that they don't need him to be a superstar. They need him to manage the game. And I think back, you mentioned Greg McElroy. I think about Greg McElroy. Now, obviously, this is not me saying Florida is going to be the 2009 Alabama team, but Greg McElroy is not a great quarterback. He was a great game manager. He played mistake-free football and he had a lot of talent around him. And if Florida could just have something similar to that, I think that they could be really successful. So I'm honestly not as concerned about the quarterback position as I think other people maybe are.
Well, and I think, and we'll get to the running back position in a second, but we probably have two of the best running backs in the entire conference, if not the country. I don't think they're getting enough love nationally, ETN and Johnson, because those guys this year, one of them could conceivably have 1,000 yards rushing, so long as the offensive line stays healthy. I think that's really one of the big keys with the quarterback position this year is if the offensive line stays healthy, because if you look at his statistics at Wisconsin, he threw 26 interceptions, but he was sacked 47 times. And when a quarterback is under duress, the amount he was, and he doesn't have the talent level that he's going to be now playing with here at the University of Florida, that's when mistakes can happen, especially against bigger opponents. So I think that's really the key is the guys around him have to remain healthy, and he needs that solid offensive line play to protect him in those short intermediate routes where he excels at, and then let those running backs just thrive in this offense.
Yeah, I mean, I think Florida has top 3 running back room in the conference. Probably means that it's top 3 nationally, right? And you do have to rely on it. I talk to Shannon Snell a lot, and he's out to practice on a regular basis, and he is always like, this offensive line is deeper than it was last year. You know, it may not be, they may not have the individual superstar, but this team is deep. Now, we have had a couple of injuries. We had, a player have to leave because of family issues. And so when those things happen, obviously that changes things. But I think the offensive line has the ability to be a position of strength for Florida. And if they are, then that means the running back room can really shine to the best of its ability. And they are so talented. And, it stinks what happened to Cam Carroll. I was expecting some good things out of him this season. And I'm really sad that he is injured. But this also now opens the door for Trayon Webb to have an opportunity to maybe see the field a little bit, and developing the future is not a bad thing either.
Well, and Billy Napier showed last year he's not afraid to play freshmen. I mean, I remember we on this podcast said that we thought ETN was going to have to wait his turn, and ETN played in the first game of the season and played a big part in that victory over Utah. So I would anticipate this year that to not be any different. I think a lot of freshmen are going to play, and a lot of transfers are going to play.
Yeah, that wasn't we. That was me. I'll eat that.
I wasn't going to call you out, but you just called yourself out.
No, I'll take it. I'll because in fairness, I still had PTSD from the way Mullen did things. I'd forgotten that Mullen was very much not a part of that game anymore. But no, that was me. I'll accept that L.
Hey, that's a good one to take, right? Like, that's an okay thing to be wrong about.
I thought Naquan was primed for a big year, and Lorenzo Lingard, but
yeah. I thought Lorenzo Lingard was going to have a big year too. And I really liked him as a person. So I was hoping, I think that he would have a good year. But I mean, Florida's running backs room were, really one of the lone bright spots of the season last year for me.
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely. So really quick before we move on to quarterback, I think we just kind of covered running back pretty well, but backups. Is there a backup that you maybe like in the situation? I'm on the Max Brown train a little bit. I think there's a lot of upside for him.
Yeah.
Potentially being the backup eventually. I know Jack Miller has been out with a couple of injuries, tendonitis in the shoulder, I believe right now, but what do you assess behind Graham Mertz?
Yeah, I think Max Brown is the guy behind him. When I was there on Friday, Miller was in the pit, so he wasn't even practicing at all. He was out, and Max Brown looked good. I mean, he looked decent. He was going against the scrimmage that we watched. They had 1s versus 2s, so we never actually were looking at strength on strength. So that's a little bit harder to evaluate what you're looking at. So he was going against all of the 1s on defense, but he held his own, and I think that, and he's throwing to your second string guys as opposed to your first string, and they still had a decent day. So I think that he has the ability to be serviceable. I don't want to get in a situation where Mertz goes down, because who knows what it is that we're going to see. I think Max Brown is such an unknown commodity at this point, even more so than Mertz is for us. It's not a deep room. It's just not. And so, it wouldn't shock me if they took somebody in the portal next year, not because because they need the depth, essentially.
Well, and you never know. Graham Mertz still has a year of eligibility. So best case scenario, let's say he has a good season, not ready for the league, he comes back, and Lagway can actually sit a year to prepare for hopefully maybe 2025. So he's not thrown in the gauntlet.
Yeah, I mean, him being able to sit the whole year would be amazing. Or even think about like what happened to Chris Leak, where he like kind of slowly came along. I think he became the starter by like the Kentucky game of 2020 or 2003. Both of those scenarios are a better scenario for Lagway than starting week one, an SEC schedule like we have as an 18-year-old freshman. So if we can avoid that situation, I think that would be way better for Lagway's long-term development.
Definitely. All right, so we've got quarterback, running back. Let's move to receivers. And I think this is a room where obviously Ricky Pearsall is primed, as Billy Napier said, for a big season.
Yeah.
But behind him, there's a lot of unproven players. And this isn't to say that room won't be successful this year or won't be strength. I think there's a lot of talent in the freshman room, but kind of give your thoughts on where the receiver room is at right now and who are maybe some guys behind Ricky Pearsall that could emerge.
So I think that, behind Ricky Pearsall in the slot, probably Trey Wilson is somebody that we will see some productivity out of. I think Caleb Douglas and Marcus Burke will probably start alongside Pearsall, but I'm interested to see what Andy Jean can do. I think that, he is such an incredible talent. Aiden Mizell, Khalil Jackson just got scholarship this summer. I have a special place in my heart for him because his family is the third generation family, and I'm part of the second. And I'm interested to see him, but there is a lot of talent. It's just all unproven and all really young for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, Florida kind of got a treasure trove in the wide receiver class last year with those three freshmen with Mizell, Eugene Wilson, who you mentioned, goes by Trey Wilson. Mm-hmm. Andy Jean's the one that has me excited. That, I mean, all of them do. I mean, Eugene Wilson, the elusiveness, Aiden Mizell, the speed and length, but Andy Jean feels like he could be the wild card of this unit. And Allie, I want to ask you about him in a second, but first, before we talk more about Andy Jean, got to shout out our merch store. That's right. We've got new merch that is for sale on anallkindsofweather.com/merch that is comfortable, lightweight for those hot summer days, and makes it very clear to everybody you come across which team you pull for. From 100% polyester workout tees, soft style cotton tees, sport tech polos, quarter zips, hoodies, beanies, baseball caps, trucker hats, koozies, tumblers, pint glasses, and more. We've got just the gear you're looking for this football season. Our gear is sold in 4 colors, orange, blue, black, and white, and it all features that sleek new alligator logo that pays homage to all your favorite moments in Florida Gator history. So don't wait. Get yours today so you can have it for our home opener against McNeese. Go to inallkindsofweather.com/merch to get yours now. That's inallkindsofweather.com/merch. So with that taken care of, Allie, as I mentioned a second ago, Andy Jean is the one that intrigues me the most. From what you've heard, I mean, obviously you're very well connected. You hear a lot, you see a lot yourself. Which of those 3 rookie receivers for the Florida Gators do you think is most likely to have a breakout season?
That's a great question because I feel like everybody I talk to has a different answer, but they all mention Wilson, Mizell, and Jean. So, I think Wilson will play a little bit behind Pearsall. So maybe that's a negative for him because Ricky Pearsall is going to be wide receiver 1 and he's going to get a lot of the action there. Out of the wide receivers that are starting, Burke is probably the one that I see that could be overtaken the most. So maybe that favors Andy Jean or Aiden Mizell more. But I've honestly heard such good things about all 3 of them. And I do think at the end of the year, our starting wide receiver lineup maybe looks different than it does on day 1.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I think Pearsall and Caleb Douglas are your 2 guys for sure that are probably locked in. Mm-hmm. But behind that, I do see a freshman overtaking potentially Jacavion Frazier if he does not live up to what he needs to do in order to keep his position as the starter at this present time. Because I think a lot of projections show him as the starter right now, as that 3rd receiver. But, I mean, there are guys clearly nipping at his heels, and Andy Jean, Trey Wilson, and Aiden Mizell all made big plays in fall camp.
And that's the thing I wanted to point out, too. I'm higher on Caleb Douglas than a lot of Gator fans seem to be. His name seems to be kind of forgotten about when people are talking about Florida receivers. Yeah, there's some hype from Marcus Burke, especially from the Jacksonville area Gators. Obviously, they're going to hype their local kid up. Ricky Pearsall is the obvious one. Yeah, of course. Ricky Pearsall is the obvious one, and then there's that trio of freshman wide receivers. Caleb Douglas. I mean, I was right. I was high up, but I was in that corner of the end zone in Aggie Land where he made that touchdown catch where he just boxed out his defender and makes a great catch. And I see that, and I'm like, that's an NFL type play. Like to go up and like box out your guy and get the rebound like that. That's a real big league play he just made. So what have you been hearing about him? Maybe justifying that hype he sort of ended the year with last year, carrying on into this year.
Well, he had some great plays in the scrimmage on Friday. And he, first of all, he is faster than I realized, or at least looks faster in person than I think maybe was mentally giving him credit for. He's got long arms. He's got a lot of height. But I would say he drew some of the largest like oohs and ahs from the crowd. And this scrimmage is different than when there's an open practice scrimmage, because these are people that are really difficult to impress, because they've all been there. Right. And so I guess they have I don't want to say a higher standard. That sounds terrible, but like they just are harder to impress. And I think that a lot of people were talking about Caleb Douglas and what he was capable of. So it kind of made me excited for him. I think that he could have a big year, and Florida needs that, right? They can't rely solely on Ricky Pearsall. Pearsall is good, but Pearsall is going to get double covered a lot. He's going to draw the attention of the best defenders of whoever Florida is playing. So that does allow some opportunity for some other guys, but people have to make plays when given that opportunity, or Florida's offense is not going to be able to be multidimensional.
Definitely. Well, we'll have to see. I think it's a position that has the highest upside maybe of any on the offense right now, but we've got to see those guys go out and prove it on the field when it comes time. Let's shift gears to tight end. I think this is a group that, at least in my opinion, has left a lot to be desired. Billy Napier does a lot of two tight end sets. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't taken off in his tenure yet, but there's some young guys in this group that could definitely, I think, make some plays. Arlis Boardingham is certainly one that comes to mind, who I think kind of has those physical ability to go up and get the ball and also be very fast on the field. So what do you think, though, about this position group? Who do you think emerges from it?
Okay, so Boardingham is one that I have had on my list as well. I think that he does have all of the physical attributes. I think he's a really good blocker. I think that he has really good hands. I have been underwhelmed with how Napier used tight ends last year, and I don't know if that's because he didn't feel like he had a whole lot of talent there to use, or but Florida has done really well with tight ends. If you look over the past 20 years, like that is, Florida always has good tight ends and they always get good production out of them. They're not just blockers in these Florida offenses that have had any sort of success over the last 2 decades. So Florida is going to need production out of their wide receivers, their tight ends, not just look at them as extensions of the offensive line. Like they are a potential real weapon. Dante Zanders is another person. I'm interested to see Caleb Odom, and part of that's just because he's a legacy, and I'm excited to see what he can do. I know he knows what it means to wear the logo on the chest. So I personally want to see him do well, but I also have heard his name as being somebody that is kind of showing out a little bit.
Well, and he's had to battle back from injuries. And to be fair, this is a room that's experienced a lot of injuries. Unfortunately, Keon Zipper torn ACL out for this season. Jonathan Odom is coming back from an ACL injury late last year, still recovering on the mend.
I don't know why I said Caleb Odom. Sorry.
Oh, it's Caleb Odom. Yeah, another tight end prospect out there. But, I think that it's a room that has incurred a lot of injuries, but hopefully it allows some of the younger guys to step up in that void, and we'll have to see. I mean, I think this is a room that needs to make a big jump.
That we, and I guess basically we've got a lot of unknown commodities at the moment. But you're right, it is a room that needs to make a jump. And if Florida's offense is going to be able to put points on the board, they're going to have to get some sort of production out of their tight ends, particularly because it seems like Napier's going kind of away from the really big I don't want to say slow, but slower wide receivers, and is looking at some of these, really quick, smaller guys. So we need these tight ends because they are kind of a change of pace then from these new younger guys that Napier is bringing in.
Definitely. And I mean, I think a lot of our red zone woes last year could be attributed to not having solid tight end play, because that's typically a position you'd target in the red zone. We had that with Kyle Pitts. We've had that with tight ends in the past, like you talked about, I think of a Ben Troop way back in the day. It's a position that has to get better if we're going to see that production increase where we actually have touchdowns and not just field goals.
Yeah. I mean, Florida has, think about the 2006 season, the 2008 season, the 2012 season. I mean, anytime that Florida has an actually productive offense, they have good tight ends.
I was going to say, we've been burned as a fan base the last couple of years by hearing all the hype about different tight ends doing well in spring ball. Summer ball comes, maybe you're starting to get, okay, he's doing well, but then the focus is on other guys, and then games start getting played, and what happened? Where is he? I don't know. We heard all this about him in spring ball. Like, we got to have that productive year out of a tight end this year. And I think Florida will have a better tight end play, or they'll have a better season out of their tight ends than they had last year for sure. I think the question is, as Chris alluded to, is how are they utilized this year? And I think part of that goes to play calling, is something that we've also been talking about, but it's just in some fashion or another, that is a mismatch advantage that Florida has got to utilize this season.
I think that in some ways we're going to have some answers about last season that come from this season. I think that sometimes we weren't sure, was it the play calling? Was it the talent or lack thereof? Whose call was XYZ at the end of the day? And I mean, I know even with Anthony Richardson, there were so many times where my personal question was, does he have the ability to call his own number? If he does, why isn't he calling it? Why does he still have control over calling it? If it's not him, why is the person whose job it isn't? I mean, and I think there's a lot of things we can look back and wonder. And so maybe those questions kind of get answered this year. And maybe it is, we didn't trust the personnel we had on the field, or we didn't like the head-to-head matchup. Who knows? But I'm interested to see what jump is made from 1 to 2 offensively in a lot of different areas, because there are question marks.
Most definitely. Well, let's jump to offensive line. I know you kind of touched on it originally with your conversations with Shannon Snell. I think it's safe to say we feel pretty good about that starting 5 that we have. But beyond that, I think there is a little bit of a concern with, at least if a guy goes down, how they reshuffle that offensive line. Sure. Because I think if an injury happens, depending on where it occurs, it probably means you move one guy to the opposite side of the line or to another position, and then you have to plug another guy in. So how do you feel, let's say 3-4 deep on that offensive line behind those starting 5?
I mean, I don't know that I think we have a 4 deep. That I think that might be wishful thinking at this point, but I think we have some talented players. We know who our starting guys are going to be, but I think about like Najee Harris is probably not going to be a starter, but he's going to be a really good piece to the puzzle. He's going to have the ability to give us fresh legs and I think contribute immediately. I think about Cameron Waits. This is somebody who should be productive for Florida. Hudson is another person. Kearney. I mean, there are bodies. I hope Florida stays injury free, and I'm glad we have, the guys that we have that are starting. I think Barber is going to be huge for Florida. I think Micah Mazuka is somebody who could have a really good year. Iguakin, obviously, we have talent. It's just whether or not this talent stays healthy. Right guard and left guard are probably a little bit more concerning than tackle, because I think we're maybe a little bit thinner in those positions. So we're going to see which guys are versatile, which guys can be moved over. But overall, I think Florida fans are going to see a strong offensive line this year. And when I say a step forward, I think it's a step forward in the equality of talent once you get past that starting 5.
And an offensive line has been a strength for the Billy Napier teams in the past at University of Louisiana. That's why he has such a successful run game and with his offense, just because, he prioritizes the trenches. And we've seen that, and also with defensive line, which we're just about to talk about, but offensive line is one of those key components to the success of his offense.
Well, offensive line is unique to college football from a talent evaluation process. I think I always talk about this in recruiting, because when you are taking high school kids, generally high school programs take just the largest bodies that they have and they put them on offensive line. There's not usually a whole lot of development unless you really are at one of the better high school programs in your state. So then when you're a college team and you're trying to evaluate this, you are evaluating based on what you think you're going to be able to teach this guy once he gets to your program, not actually the technique that he currently possesses, which is kind of different than most positions on the field. So you strike out a lot of the time, essentially. And I think that Billy Napier has wrapped his head around, both through the transfer portal and recruiting, that you have to oversign there. You have to prioritize having way more bodies than you actually think you might need, because it's a crapshoot.
Well, one of my favorite quotes from Will Muschamp, and this is partly because of his accent, but the line is, "It's a line of scrimmage league," like LIG is how you pronounce it. It's a line of scrimmage league, but it's true, because it is. That's how the SEC functions. You have to be strong at the points of attack, both on offense and defense. We just talked about the offense. The defensive line, to me, is the X factor of the whole team. I just gave away the end of the pod, but sorry, because it's a critical importance to the Florida Gators this year, because it just wasn't that great the last couple of years. Sure, there were moments. Princely did some good things here and there, but just by and large did not produce the way we would have liked it to. So there's certainly talent there. There's a lot of new faces there. Cam Jackson, Caleb Banks. They signed a treasure trove of signees out of the high school ranks. There's 5 different freshmen who are going to be coming in expected to play at a high level fairly quickly, probably among them Cam James, TJ Searcy, Will Norman. I mean, there's just a lot of different names you could pick and say, yeah, I think that guy's going to be the one. Yeah, I think that guy's going to be special. Oh, yeah, that guy's going to be the key for us. So what have you been hearing about the defensive line as a whole? And has there been a name that's come to your ears more than the rest that we should look out for?
Okay, so I actually got a text message from an unnamed booster who was at practice. This is earlier in the week, last week. And he was like, I don't think our defensive line has been this deep since 2008, which is obviously such a massive statement. And I don't know that I'm prepared to in any way compare this defensive line to 2008, but I will tell you, seeing them in person, I don't remember a time that Florida had a defensive line this size since the good years. And I think that there is a lot of talent. Kelby Collins is somebody that we've heard a lot about. Sap. Cam Jackson is somebody that I know a lot of people are really high on. But this is an incredibly deep line. And even like Big Dez, I know we made a huge deal about his weight and how much it was over the summer, but I saw him in person. He is the leanest 400 pounds I have ever seen, if he really weighs 400 pounds. And I think that this has been such a focus for Napier, because he knows you win in the trenches. Look at Georgia and look at Alabama. The recipe for success in our conference already exists. You don't have to reinvent the wheel there. And it does start in the trenches. And our offensive line got bullied last year by Georgia's defensive line. That was what eventually wore us down. We were able to hold our own for the first probably 2.5 quarters on that aspect. And then that defensive line is so big and so deep. And you mentioned a lot of the big names. I expect a good year out of Princely. Jack Pyburn is another person that I think that a lot of people have talked a lot about, but there's a lot of talent on the defensive line.
Really quick before we move to the linebackers, obviously we had the unfortunate injury of Justin Boone, but I think you mentioned a couple of names there just at the end of that statement where those guys could potentially step into his place and really plug and play and make a huge difference at that end position.
So I think that the depth that Florida has is going to pay off with the loss of Boone. And it stinks when somebody gets hurt, right? Like, we hate it for these players. They bust their butt, and then you get to where you're, 2 weeks out from getting to actually show the work that you've put in, and you get hurt, and it stinks. But the silver lining of that is there are opportunities for younger guys to step up and seize the moment. Right. And so that does allow things like that to happen. And so we'll see. We'll see who steps up and fills the position. But the good news is Florida has options there, which I don't know that you could have said that last year.
Yeah, it is one of the most unfortunate parts of sports, seeing someone get hurt, especially so close to season. It's never good. It always sucks, whether it's April or August, but just this close to the season after they go through all those 4:45 a.m. workouts or 5 a.m. workouts or whatever, and
he was celebrating too. He was just celebrating a good play.
That's pulling a Ted Ginn Jr., but not in a national championship game. But so another position where we're going to have guys step in. This is a very different type of situation, but we are having a lot of new faces step in at linebacker, particularly because, at least to me, it feels like there just isn't. You don't replace Ventrell Miller with one guy. He was so intelligent. He brought so much to the defense. Yes, it was one position, but it just feels like it's going to take multiple guys to sort of fill the void that he is leaving. So same sort of question at linebacker. Has there been a name, and I'm anticipating one that you're going to say in particular, but I'm going to let you say it and give you the moment. But has there been a name that stood out above the rest among the linebacking core? And what have you been hearing about the unit as a whole so far this summer?
So I think the unit as a whole is one of the biggest question marks for me. And I don't know that it's because there's a lack of talent. I think it's because we just haven't heard as much about them during fall camp. I feel like a lot of focus has been on the DBs. A lot of focus has been on the defensive line. And we just haven't heard as much about the linebackers. Shamar James is a name that I heard a lot at the scrimmage last Friday. I think that Derek Wingo has the opportunity to really, kind of make a name for himself. Scooby Williams is another person that I expect some big things out of. But it is going to be a lot of new faces, essentially. And you're right. Like, I don't know how you replace Miller. He was the quarterback of the defense for Florida. That's not a role that I can immediately look at our roster and be like, oh, so-and-so fills this position, so we're fine. I'm interested to see what happens at linebacker, honestly.
Yeah, and I guess that was probably the strategy, bringing in a veteran like Taraja Mitchell from Ohio State, who in an established program played, about the similar size, played the inside linebacker position, and he potentially could fill that leadership void, but that's still very difficult to do.
I mean, it is. He's obviously made some waves this week by talking about Urban Meyer encouraging him to come to Florida. He wasn't somebody that stood out to me in the scrimmage, but that's not a knock on him. It was a million degrees. I had 4 children running around, and they had us in the stands, which kind of just doesn't necessarily lend you to be able to see what's going on in all parts of the scrimmage and the drills that they had going on. But you would assume that's the hope, right? Is that they're hoping they can have some veteran leadership, because this linebacking core needs veteran leadership. But I do think that the void left by Miller gives an opportunity for somebody who maybe we're not expecting to kind of take the reins. And part of it is going to be the vocal aspect of it. Generally, you have a linebacker who is a leader in the locker room, who hypes guys up on the side. Like, when you think about these good teams, there is a defensive captain, and a lot of times it is a linebacker.
Yeah, no, I mean, we'll have to see. It's a group that had definitely in years past, I think, hasn't been great, but when Florida's defense is elite, we've had a great linebacker room. Like, you think back to those guys like Brandon Seiler, Brandon Spikes, even a guy like Ryan Stamper, like that. Those guys were leaders on those 06 and 08 teams. And even during those years where we had Alex Anzalone, Jared Davis, those were great. That was a great linebacker group too. And we had an elite defense. And ever since those guys have left, we haven't been able to replace them.
I mean, there's Florida has had good linebackers. I mean, Florida's had good defense until the last, 4 years. Florida has had elite defenses for as long as any of us have been alive. Defense has never really been Florida's issue until very, very recently. But you're right. I mean, even think about the 96 team and James Bates. I mean, when Florida is good, their linebackers are elite.
Yep. The alphas of the team tend to be in that position.
Yeah.
The defense was good until 4 years ago. I wonder what variable might have changed around that time, Chris. I wonder.
a fan of the Grantham hire. I hated Todd Grantham ever since we played. I don't know if you'll remember this. Florida played Georgia, yes, and he did the choke to Chaz Henry, who is literally stepping up to kick a field goal, which is not his actual position. And it's one thing when fans do it. It's even one thing when 18 to 22-year-old kids do it to each other. But when you're watching an adult on the sidelines do that to a kid, I could never look at Todd Grantham the same ever again and have never liked him since that moment.
And it was such a gratifying moment when he nailed that kick.
Oh my God, it was
and
so
chomped in his face.
Amazing.
Oh God, that was
Chaz is just so humble and soft spoken, and it's just Eric would have chomped him in the face on purpose, it just Chaz. So it was so gratifying for Chaz to be able to do that, because it's just he's the salt of the earth kid, and it was just so scummy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, that's a theme that he likes to liked to continue on in Simon Gainesville. But we're done with him. We got a new defensive coordinator in. I think we're in better hands. I think we were in better hands with Patrick Toney. The numbers obviously didn't show it, but a new day now with Austin Armstrong. Got one more group of players to go through. I think I just took Chris's thunder. So Chris, this is your position. Go for it.
No worries. Well, outside of linebacker, another position group, DBU. I think we loved the moniker of that at University of Florida. Haven't played like DBU the last 4 years, as Neil kind of highlighted. What do we think of this group? I think there definitely is an infusion of talent with a guy like Jakeem Jackson, who just got freshman All-American praise by On3 this week.
Yeah.
We also have some good returners, Jason Marshall, who could be having a money year this year where you potentially go to the NFL. What do we think of this room, the cornerbacks and safeties?
So I think that there is a lot of talent here. I'm excited and interested to see how it plays out. I've heard a lot of really good things about Jordan Castell. I've actually even heard that expect it at some point this season him to become a starter, because he has really shown out really well. I think Kamari Wilson is somebody that I think at the beginning people were expecting to kind of get past, and I think he's held his own and maybe surprised some on the coaching staff, even from that aspect. Kimber is another person that I'm expecting some decent things out of. Jason Marshall, you're right, though. It is a money year. He is, I guess if we're going to talk about veteran leadership in this position group, which is hard because there's so many young and fresh faces here, but he would be one of them. He should have an opportunity to kind of really show out. There's Mitchell Moten. There is talent here. There is speed here. There's just also a lot of inexperience here. And Florida's DBs weren't great last year. So I'm interested to see, though, now that there is kind of more unity within the room. It's a DB's room. It's not a safety's room and a quarterback's room. What that does, how that helps their continuity, because you've got to think when you have two different coaches coaching cornerbacks and safeties, it's very easy for the message to get muddled. It's easy for cornerbacks to say oh, well, that mess up on that play was on the safeties, and their coach may agree with them. And then there has to be kind of a meeting of the minds between a cornerbacks coach and a safeties coach to determine, okay, whose fault was it? That's not a situation Florida's going to have this year. They're going to have that answer right off the bat. So I think that there will be some improvement, and there needs to be improvement. Florida got beat deep a lot. Florida couldn't wrap up. It felt like we were, always 5 yards behind where we needed to be. And we played scared at defensive back. So there needs to be massive improvement there.
Yeah, nothing's more frustrating when you get a team in 3rd and long and then give up a 3rd and 15 over and over and over again. And it's coverage bust.
Repeat for the last 4 years. We joke about 3rd and Grantham, but then we also had it last year too. And it's oh, good. So it's actually just 3rd in Florida. It's not even necessarily that's got to change. We have got to, Florida will do its job for the first 2 downs. And then it didn't matter in 3rd down on a way too regular basis.
And 3rd in whatever distance. It wasn't just that it was always 3rd and 3 or 4. Missouri has a 3rd and 15, a 3rd and 18, a 3rd and 26 in the same quarter.
Yeah, and they get 29 yards instead. Yes. It it was insanity. I'm sure you were just as frustrated as I was to watch it last year. And it felt like we didn't adjust as quickly as maybe we needed to. And it's obviously easy to sit here and armchair quarterback what should be done, but it felt like the adjustments were slow last year. And so, and we don't know if that's on the coaching staff, if that's on the roster. But I'm looking for improvement from that this year.
Absolutely. Well, another group that we're hoping to see some improvement from is probably what Billy Napier dubs as the game changer team, or better known as special teams. Yep. Obviously, for those that don't know, Allie's husband was an All-American punter at the University of Florida, Eric Wilbur. So punter obviously is a position that you hold near and dear to your heart. But outside of punter, what are other, I mean, you can talk about punter, but kicker, the return game, what do you think of that?
Ricky Pearsall is returning punts. I kind of don't love this. I love it and I don't love it, if that makes sense. I think that Ricky Pearsall has great hands and he's got good speed, and he'll probably do a really great job as our punt returner. It terrifies me to think that there's wide receiver one being used as a punt returner. And I know, you think back to the Urban Meyer days, like he would put his best players on special teams. And I get the theory behind that. I also think those teams were deep enough to allow you to have your best players on special teams and it be okay. And I don't know that we're quite deep enough for that to be the case, but here we are. This is what we're doing. We've got Trevor Etienne probably returning kicks. Andy Jean will probably see time there as well. I think Trey Wilson will get some probably, punt return practice there. I'd kind of love for it to be Trey Wilson and maybe not be Ricky Pearsall. That would maybe make me feel better. But Florida overall special teams has to improve. And I think that when you think about all of the successful teams that Florida had, they always had great special teams. There's a possibility that people watch this documentary that's out on Netflix right now and then remember those special teams and get real pissed this season if it's not a focus. But it's a no-brainer to me to get the special teams wins. Almost no teams choose to focus on it, but the ones that do have great success. Like Urban Meyer used to have a quote that said, block a punt, win the game. And the stat was something insane. Like 93% of the time, if you block a kick in a game, you win that game. I mean, the stats are absolutely insane. So I hope that that's a little bit more of a focus. And I kind of understand why it wasn't last year, because the offense and the defense were both so atrocious that if you've got to put focus in somewhere, it's probably going to be there as opposed to special teams. But it's a key component. And I think had Florida been better on special teams last year, they probably pick up another win. So I hope that is a major area of improvement for the Gators.
People forget how terrible it was in November alone. They lost that Vanderbilt game. They were terrible in the win against South Carolina. If we win the game by 32 points and you have a field goal blocked, you muff the snap at another field goal, you fumble a punt, and you give up a fake punt touchdown in a game you win by 32. I think if Florida loses that game, there's a lot more attention on it than there already was.
I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, that thankfully the team was good enough in other aspects that it didn't matter. But in most of the time, you make the amount of special teams mistakes that you make in that game, you lose for sure. And the missed field goals have to stop. I think Mahalik is who they've said is going to handle field goals, and Trey Smack will do kickoffs, which that's fine. But I hope they had somebody out there working with them. I hope that they're working with the holder. I know when Chris Hetland had his streak of missing field goals in the 2006 season, they eventually figured out that it was the hold. And that was what was causing, some of the issues. And so it may not necessarily be on the field goal kicker, but I did see a lot of really low kicks last year, which, constantly gives me a heart attack. But I would sit and watch these games with Eric, and I'm telling you, they would line up. The ball would not even be snapped. And he'd be like, that's going to be wide left, or that's going to be wide right. And he was right every single time, because there was something they were doing repetitively wrong. And those are the kind of things where the coaching staff has to be able to notice it on film and make those changes.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I think that it's an X factor. I mean, the special teams is an X factor in a game. If you can flip a field and you can set your team up with good field position, it makes a huge difference, especially when you have an offense that may not be as explosive as it was last year.
But if you're going to call them something like game changers, you've got to put the time and energy into actually making them positive game changers.
Right. Not losing the game changer. I thought that was, I mean, And it has to make a difference on a consistent basis too. It can't be one of those things where, sometimes it'll help you, but other times it hurts you, and other times it doesn't make a difference. Like Mahalik has to be, or Florida has to have a kicker that can hit those 45, 50, even 55-yard field goals, because that's what the University of Florida expects. I mean, we've had Evan McPherson, we've had Caleb Sturgis, we've had Eddie Pinheiro, we had Judd Davis back in the day. Like, Florida is a school that churns out big-time kickers. Yeah. Like, that's just part of who we are, and we have to get back to that.
And we're recruiting at such a high level that there is zero reason why we can't go out and pick the guy that we want. You know, there are good high school kids coming out. There are guys that come in the portal. If we don't have what we need here, then we need to look elsewhere. Trey Smack, I want to say, was the number one kicker coming out of high school 2 years ago. He was somewhere, very high. Clearly he hasn't won the job. I'm pretty sure Mahalik was a walk-on that I'd have to do more research, but I'm pretty sure he was a walk-on that won that job. Do you know?
He was a walk-on. He's from Tampa.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think he proved himself early on. Yeah. He had a couple of big kicks in the spring. Clearly he's got a handle on the job. And I don't think it's interesting how they're doing Smack for kickoffs and then Mahalik for field goals. I mean, Smack has probably the better leg and distance, but Mahalik is consistently being a more accurate. That's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah. And I mean, we've seen that happen. Like I think about Matt Petrovich while Eric punted. I mean, that definitely happens sometimes, but consistency is the key. You said it. That's exactly what it needs to be. Florida needs consistency. Field goal kicking is it's a head case sport, right? Like it's an individual sport within a team sport, and it's very mental. And if you've got to have a coaching staff that understands not just special teams, but actually how kickers work, because they're wired totally differently than pretty much anybody else on the field.
Dang, alley dropping and blast from the pass, Matt Petrovich. That guy would go down and run and tackle the returner. He was not afraid of contact for being a kicker.
No, he actually loved contact. That was he looked for contact.
Yeah. Yep. Well, okay. So we've done all of the position groups. I think it's safe to say that we've obviously got to see big improvement from defense. And that may be, as Neil mentioned, one of his X factors for success this season. But we need to see obviously improvement in special teams if we're to win games. So let's get into the schedule. We'll go through all the games. Allie, we're going to open the floor to you. Give us, game by game, your prediction and a percentage chance that you think Florida has to win each game. So we'll start with Utah.
Okay, so I think Florida has, I'm going to say, a 70% chance to win the Utah game. I am fairly confident that Florida heads out there and takes care of business. So I was in the game in the Swamp last year. The size difference between Florida and Utah was very noticeable. But I think it'll be even bigger of a difference this year. Florida has gotten larger on both offensive and defensive line, and we already dominated there size-wise last year. I think obviously Cam Rising is going to be a game time decision. I expect that he does actually play. That doesn't mean that he's 100%. I can't imagine that they fully take the training wheels off. I don't know that I think it's incredibly smart to play him if you're not going to take the training wheels off. But I think that Florida can go out there and win. Now, if they do, I think that really sets up the tone for the first half of the season. If they lose, I think it could potentially go very differently into the beginning of the season. But I actually think that Florida does beat Utah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just imagining a scenario where Florida beats Utah. They obviously steamroll McNeese, and you roll into that primetime game. First Tennessee, 2-0. The Swamp is going to be electric.
And when you look at the top 10, I want to say Tennessee's sitting at like 12 right now. And you look at the top 10, at least Florida State and LSU play each other. Like there's a couple of big matchups between the first 2 weeks. There's a great possibility Tennessee's in the top 10 by the time you actually play. So this is a 7:00 game in the Swamp after Florida will have beaten Utah, who nobody nationally is going to think that Florida has the ability to beat. Obviously, Vegas at the moment still doesn't think Florida has the ability to beat. That is going to be probably the craziest night of the year in the stadium, unless Florida has a way better than expected season and then it becomes the Florida State game at the end of the year. That stadium will be insane. It'll be electric. It'll be before any heartbreak, happens, which inevitably will at some point in the season. And Florida kicks Tennessee's ass in Gainesville on a pretty regular basis. So if Florida beats Utah, I think Florida beats Tennessee.
Also got to point out with Florida, Utah, you just mentioned Vegas. That line is plummeting. Started at, I think it was 8, and it's shrunk
10 and a half. Started at 10 and a half.
10 and a half. Okay, so it has more than shrunken in half.
It's 5 right now.
It's 4.
Is it 4 now? Okay. I was looking at it earlier and it was at 5.
It is just absolutely dropping like a rock. And that, again, I think what you mentioned, the size difference between Florida and Utah, the question about Cam Rising, that's a game that I happen to agree with you. If Florida goes and wins that, especially on the road, they pull that off, and it could set the tone for quite a nice first half of the season for sure. So we're going to go game by game through the rest of the season. But before we do that, I want to remind y'all that we are proudly partnered with the Gator Good Foundation, the nonprofit organization that works to bring underprivileged Gator fans to their first ever Florida Gator football game in the Swamp, which this year will be against the Arkansas Razorbacks. Just debuted those black jerseys on social media. It will be Military Appreciation Day. That is the reason for the black jerseys. We are saluting those who serve. And as such, the Gator Good Foundation is looking for a current military member, a military veteran, or someone else who is otherwise connected to the military to bring to this year's game. If you believe that you or someone you know is worthy of the honor, please email us at gatorgoodfoundation@gmail.com. It is an all expenses paid trip to the Swamp to see the Florida Gators. Please remember, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So we would love to bring everyone. We would truly love to bring everyone who is connected to the military who applies, but we are looking specifically for someone who is unable to make the trip work on their own means. So please keep that in mind when you apply. We look forward to reading your stories, and we hope to choose someone very soon. Again, it is gatorgoodfoundation@gmail.com. So game 2 of the season with our very, very fond partners, Gator Good Foundation, taking care of Arkansas. We'll get to in a little bit, but game 2, McNeese, Florida. Can't ever say that Florida's 100% after Georgia Southern. So Allie, with that in mind, I'm assuming you're not going to go a great deal lower than that, but where do you put that game for Florida? Is there any chance the unthinkable happens?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that we never want to, they play the games on Saturdays for a reason. So I would say 99%, but this is a good opportunity to try some different things, try some different sets, get some younger guys on the field, give an opportunity to, be a little bit more, I don't know, take some chances, right? I don't think that you open the playbook or anything like that, but I think it's a good opportunity to see what you've got. You've got the third and fourth quarter. Hopefully the game is well taken care of after, the first quarter, and you can let some younger guys get some real game experience.
It'd be cool to see maybe Max Brown sling it, the second half. You get those freshman receivers really, warmed up before they potentially could play a big conference game, which we'll cover here in a second with Tennessee. I think there's, like you said, there's a lot of opportunity. People overlook those games because they think they're foregone conclusions, which they should be. But getting those freshmen where we have a team full of them to that experience is huge in these opportunities.
I mean, this whole team is unproven for the most part. There's so many guys who right now we're just living on potential, right? And so to give them the opportunity to get the jersey dirty against an opponent that can give them some confidence is huge.
Yep. Well, speaking of potential, Tennessee, as we talked about just a second ago, has the potential to be the biggest game of the season in the Swamp. Allie, I think I know you're probably leaning on this one, but what do you think of the matchup and percent chance Florida has to win?
I think Florida wins. I would say I'm a little bit less confident about this game than Utah. So maybe I'll say 60%, 65%, something like this. But I think Florida can win. I think that until Tennessee can prove to me consistently then they could take care of business against the Gators, Florida's in their head as far as I'm concerned. But I just can't, there's not going to be a scenario, at least in my mind, where the Swamp is more electric this upcoming season than that night. And I think that the crowd carries a huge momentum in this game. And I think Gator fans are going to be happy. I think that Florida can take care of business against Tennessee. And for those of you counting at home, when you think about what Florida's record's going to be at the end of the day, I think that the 5 games that people put on their radar as like the games that Florida maybe shouldn't win, Utah and Tennessee are 2 of those games. So if Florida starts the season 3-0, that means they've already taken care of business 2 different times where the naysayers say they shouldn't.
All right. Well, right there, you mentioned something I've got to follow up on. Right there, you talk about the Swamp being electric. It's going to be a game where you think Florida's in the opponent's head. I want to go back specifically for 1 second to the Utah game last year. Cam Rising throws the game losing interception. Do you see a direct cause and effect relationship between the crowd being rowdy and him deciding to throw that ball to, I think it was Dalton Kincaid who was sitting down, but to his decision to throw that ball where it was, or the location that was on that ball that Amari Vernon was able to jump in and pick it off? Do you see a direct cause and effect relationship between the crowd's noise and that play and others like it?
And 50%. Utah had never experienced what they experienced last year. I think they thought, like, we've played in the Rose Bowl, we've played in big games before. They had never played in the Swamp, and we did get in Cam Rising's head, and that was the difference right there. The Swamp does have the ability, when it's at its best, to actually be a game changer, and it was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think last year it's kind of nice we had that moment because
we needed it the rest of the season.
I was going to
say nothing else went right.
No, but it was good for our players to feel that, right? It's good for them to know that, like, hey, when you need us, the fans are here. We will have your back here. I think it was good for Napier to experience what a true night game, but a true, like, where Florida has the ability to be a momentum changer and what Florida football feels like when it's good. And it was good that night.
Well, that's what he can build toward and strive for. And he will have another chance to win a night game in the Swamp the following week. Granted, Charlotte is not a big time opponent, but it is another game the Florida Gators will be playing in the Swamp. And we cannot knock these types of opponents because, again, look back to last year, South Florida. We need them to mess up a routine hold and a field goal to avoid overtime with them. And they go 1-11 last year. So we're not going to dismiss the possibility.
I was trying to say all the lies I could about how USF was going to potentially win their conference because of how good they were against us.
That
was miserable. Which should never have been that close. The talent gap between these two programs is like a high school program playing a college program. Yet there we were.
Right. So do you think, and I know there's some similarities. I think Charlotte has a running quarterback. They do wear green. It is going to be a night game. There are some of the similarities here and there, but do you think the unthinkable happens?
No, I don't. I think that that's going to be the thing that we see about this Billy Napier team. I don't know that on paper the record's going to look too terribly different this upcoming season than it did last year. But I do think what's going to look different to Florida fans is the taking care of the games that you should. I think that Billy Napier and company will do a better job taking care of the McNeeses, the Charlottes, the Vanderbilts, the teams that you really absolutely, there should be zero question you are getting this win.
Well, speaking of taking care of teams we should, in which we did 31 straight times before 2018. Next up, the Kentucky Wildcats, who have beat us 3 of the last 5 years. What do you think of this matchup in Lexington, which is shaping up to be, I think, a must-win game for Billy Napier?
I think that there's a decent chance Florida loses this game. I think that Florida and Kentucky are closer talent-wise than people maybe would like to admit. I think it's difficult to play in Lexington at night, particularly recently for Florida. I think that Kentucky is in Florida's head a little bit. These players don't know Kentucky as the Kentucky team that we know them as. They know them as the team that routinely beats them. I think that it is going to be a tough matchup. This is a coin flip game for me. And Kentucky has had Florida's number more often than not recently.
So coin flip 50%. Where do you? Okay,
50%. I think it is a 50% it's a coin flip game. I think that when I looked at my predictions for the overall season, I think I wrote this down as a loss because I do think that Florida probably loses a coin flip or two that they shouldn't. And I think they beat some teams that they shouldn't. And Kentucky is one of those ones that I think that they could end up on the wrong side of.
Alrighty, so right now you're looking at maybe a 4-1 start for the Gators if we lose that coin flip game. Next up, though, we have homecoming. Vanderbilt, a team that we should have beat last year. We didn't, as Neil mentioned. Special teams got the best of us in that game. What do you think about this one in a revenge spot for homecoming?
I think that Florida beats Vanderbilt. I think that if Billy Napier is as self-reflective as I believe that he is, I think this is a game he puts emphasis on. Florida shouldn't lose to Vanderbilt. That is not the rosters aren't the same. The programs aren't the same. The history is not the same. There is no reason for Florida to lose to Vanderbilt. And I think that Billy Napier knows that one stings more than most from last year. And so I do think, and it's homecoming, I think that Florida does what they need to do against Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I mean, I see a scenario last year. If we win that game like we should have in Nashville, we're 7-4. We go into that game in Tallahassee. You're looking at a potentially 8-win season, which Gator fans would have taken in a heartbeat in the first year.
1,000,000%.
So next game, though, South Carolina, another, I think, potential coin flip game. Neil and I think this is the trap game for Florida. If we look at a road game, we're a little bit higher on us versus Kentucky, but South Carolina, we think is a trap game. What do you think about this spot? Coming off of a homecoming win against Vanderbilt now, maybe 5-1. Where do you think we land with this one?
So this is another hard one. South Carolina was an enigma for me last year. You know, we beat them 38-7, I believe is what it was. And then they go out and beat the pants off of a Tennessee team that was incredibly talented and poised to make the playoffs. And so that was such a weird, 2-week span to watch because are we good? Are they good? Are we I had no idea what to think about that. I do think South Carolina is a program on the rise. I think that Columbia is overall a difficult place to be. That game will probably be at night. I think that Beamer would love nothing more than to get that win. Florida gets the best of everybody, which is also another factor in this. I don't know that I think Florida gives their best against everybody, which hopefully is something that will change, but we 100% get everybody's best shot every single week. South Carolina, it makes their season if they can beat Florida. If they can beat Florida, it doesn't even matter what happens most weeks for them because they're going to spend the whole year campaigning on the fact that they beat the Gators. So yeah, I mean, I think it could be a trap game, but I actually think Florida takes care of business in this one, but it is a coin flip game as well.
I would love to be as optimistic about this game as you are. Frankly, I mean, because I know that they're going to be preaching everything that you hear on day one that you sign up for Pee Wee ball. Protect the football. Hey, we fumbled 3 straight possessions last year. Maybe let's protect the football and not turn it over like that. Spencer Rattler, you didn't look comfortable last year. Maybe let's go through a little bit more study sessions this year against Florida. They're going to make sure that they give Florida their very best, like you just said, but not even because we're Florida, because they need this game. Because if you look at their schedule, there is a road game at Georgia. There is a road game at Tennessee. North Carolina to start the year could be a loss. They could be reeling and desperate coming into this game, needing a win against us to save their season because there's still a game with Clemson later in the year. So they might be needing this just to make a bowl game.
Yeah.
For as strong as they think about themselves.
Absolutely. And it's Columbia's a tough place to play. It's potentially cold. There's a lot of factors that'll come to play here. And again, I think this is a coin flip. If you can go 1-1 against Kentucky and South Carolina, that's an improvement, I guess. Well, I mean, maybe not because they went 1-1 against them last year. But this South Carolina team is going to be even improved from the one we played last year, who ended up being pretty darn good. But you're right. I mean, it's a tough game for sure.
Well, and I mean, look, if we're, like you said, 1-1 between Kentucky and South Carolina, but we're going into the bye week versus Georgia with a 6-1 record, we'll take it. That is huge.
100%.
And a 6-1 record, that sets up a showdown in Jacksonville. I think the last couple times, or at least early in the Dan Mullen tenure, we rolled into that game with one loss, and it was a top 10 matchup. So 6-1, maybe that'd be the case again. I think we're expecting Georgia, as they are preseason ranked number 1. I'm not high on them. I don't think they're going to win three-peat a national championship, but they're certainly going to be a team that will be poised to potentially win it again. Yeah. What do we think of this matchup? Is it closer than it has been in the last 2 years?
So, I think about this game, I think maybe a little bit differently than most people do. I think, 2 years ago, Dan Mullen's last year, Florida absolutely could have beaten that Georgia team. And even with the wheels falling off, the way that they were, I still think they could have. I don't think that game was that massive of a gap. And then last year, Florida was in that game for 2.5 quarters. And I think, the score at the end of the day didn't really feel like what it felt like to me. I don't know that it ever felt like Florida was going to take the lead, but it very much felt like Florida was in it until they weren't, essentially. They were in it until R2 Deep got tired. Then at that point, Georgia's depth is what won that game. So I don't know that I prescribe to this idea that there's just this massive gap between the two programs, because I don't know that it's that big. And it's 2 years. We won the year before that. Like, I feel like Georgia talks about it like, nobody even remembers back when Florida used to win, kind of thing. Like this, Florida has dominated Georgia for the better part of the last 30 years. That just hasn't the last 2. I don't think Florida wins this game, but I think that Florida shows that the gap is not as big as the national media would allow you to believe. And I think that Florida gets another year or 2 under their belt with Napier's recruits. And this goes back to being either a coin flip game or a Florida becomes dominant again. I don't think that we're as far away from the Georgia program as I think most would tell you we are.
Well, certainly one can hope that. And let's say we do lose this game, though, we move into that Arkansas game. This has been a letdown spot in recent years. Like, I think back to 2018, we laid an egg to Missouri, a Missouri team. We definitely were better than that year. What happens this year, rolling into an Arkansas game where I think it's probably another toss-up game, potentially? Arkansas does return Jefferson at quarterback. What do you think about this matchup?
So I have Florida winning this game, but I think this is going to be one of those like bellwether moments for Billy Napier, because more than likely they're coming off this loss to Georgia. So he is going to be in a position where, okay, can you convince your players that the rest of the season is entirely worth playing for? You're not going to play in an SEC championship game. You're not going to play in the playoffs, but the rest of the season is absolutely worth fighting for. And I think that we will see that from him, because we saw that from his team last year. Florida had nothing to play for the second half of the season, truly, but they showed up every single day. It didn't mean that they were necessarily more talented. It obviously didn't result into a win every single week, but I don't think we ever watched this Florida team take the field and ever feel like they're not even trying. We did feel that at the end with the Dan Mullen tenure. We did feel that sometimes with McElwain. We even felt that sometimes with Muschamp's teams. I never got the feeling last year that Billy Napier's team ever gave up at all. And that's something that stems directly from the person that's leading your program. So I have faith in the fact that Napier will be able to galvanize, because I do think it's coming off a loss, but bellwether moment.
For sure. Bellwether moment, culture defining moment for the program to show how far it's come. And as Neil has been teasing and talking about in his article, where we came from during Dan Mullen era and now into the Billy Napier area. So that, I agree, that's a big game. And obviously, we got to make those all black uniforms count for that game.
Or we're gonna have to burn them. So I know people want to see these a lot, so we need a win in them.
I'll also point out that the Gator Good Foundation is 4-0 all time at bringing candidates to games. We've beaten South Carolina in 18, that comeback game where we were down 31-14. That was our first one. We won that. We blew out Vanderbilt the next year, 56-0. 2021, we blasted Tennessee despite the rest of the year indicating that we probably should not have. And last year, we beat Missouri 24-17. So we're putting that on the line. Gator Good Foundation has never lost a game that we have brought our candidate to. So hopefully that continues. It better, because black uniforms, military appreciation. There's too much voting on this.
Thankful for and play hard for on that game.
Absolutely.
Well, moving to after Arkansas, hopefully coming off a big win, and Gator will be 5-0 at that point. We go to LSU. And this is one of the latest times we would have played LSU in the schedule outside of the 2016 reschedule and then the 2020 shoe throw game that got rescheduled to December during the whole COVID pandemic. What do we think of this game? LSU is getting a lot of love by the media. Many even believe they may be the best team in the SEC West, if not the entire conference.
So, I think the LSU is interesting. So last year, they have a new coach in Brian Kelly. But if you look at what LSU did recruiting wise in the 4 years leading up to Brian Kelly's first season, they averaged a number 3 rated class. So the amount of talent, even though obviously they let go of Ed Orgeron and they felt like, they didn't have it moving in the right direction, he left the cupboard completely full. That team, there was no rebuild that needed to happen. There was almost like a redirection that needed to happen. They needed somebody to just kind of reorganize all of the treasure trove that they already had. So it's different than the type of rebuild that we had to do here at Florida. So it's not surprising to me that they were able to win, right away, and perform well, because they had the talent to do so. I think we'll continue to see that this year. I'm interested to see, I think we'll find out what kind of coach Brian Kelly is as this goes on further. He's not used to having to get up for a game week in and week out. That wasn't the reality at Notre Dame. That wasn't the reality at Cincinnati. I mean, the SEC is just built different. Every single week is your Super Bowl. But I think the LSU beats Florida. I think that they are the more talented team. The game is in Baton Rouge. More than likely, they'll give us a night game, which I hope they do. That's just the best absolute environment for a night game in college football, in my opinion. And I think Florida loses. But I think as long as they are in it, as long as they continue to fight, like, there's growth that can be had in a loss.
I agree. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is, how does it look? If we lose a game, how does it look? Is it competitive? Does the team fight? Do they not give up? Do they continue to march on? That really could be the defining moment and the turning point for the program as you go from year 2 to year 3. But moving on, I think maybe another defining moment for this program. How do they react going up to Columbia, Missouri? This is, as you talked about, a team that has unfortunately given Florida wits end the last decade since they've joined the SEC. This will be a late November game. It'll be cold, could be rainy, could be even a night game. What do we think about this Missouri team, who is starting to get some buzz too in the SEC East?
So historically, when we go to Missouri, it is the end of November. It's freaking freezing. It is so flat there and so windy. It affects so many things. I can remember Tommy Townsend calling Eric from the locker room and being like, dude, it's 30 miles an hour winds. Like, what do I even do? Just being completely freaked out by the weather that you experience there. We historically get put at that 11 a.m. spot. 11 a.m. Central Time. I think Florida plays terribly in those early games. I don't know what it is, because it almost doesn't matter who the players are. Florida just plays terrible at that time of day. Fans aren't into it yet. Players are only half awake. It's early. I think Florida can win this, but I also think this is another one of those tests. I don't want to say it's a coin flip game, because I think Florida should and can take care of business, but they are going to have to be incredibly focused. This is a possibility to be, if you go to Baton Rouge and you lose, it's going to take something special for Billy Napier to redirect and focus and get them fired up for a game that is not fun to get fired up for. It's not fun to play in the freezing wind. It's not fun to play at 11 o'clock in the morning. Nobody cares about Missouri, so it's hard to use that as a motivating factor. They don't see them as a rival. They don't see them. So there is going to be some mental gymnastics that has to go on from this coaching staff to make sure that this team shows up. But I expect that they do, and I think that they win.
One piece of feedback I've gotten from Alex Brown about this is when it's cold like that, that ball turns into a rock.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it completely changed. I mean, you're talking about Graham Mertz being a game manager, though. That might actually work to Florida's advantage, even if they're not used to the cold weather. Yep. They can run the ball down Missouri's throat. So I'm actually higher on Florida's percent chance to win this game than I think most Gator fans I've seen with their win percentage projections. And Chris will tell you, he's the optimistic one of us too. Like I'm the Debbie Downer of this show, and I have a very strong feeling that Florida pulls this out. Although it very well could be one of the very few times in Gator history that they play a game in the snow. It's not unreasonable to think that in November in the middle of Missouri. But I'm just this is one where like I'm the one that's super down on South Carolina. I don't think much of our chances against Georgia or Utah, but I'm rubbing my crystal ball on this one. I think Florida's got this one.
Well, I mean, I kind of lump this into the category of Missouri, Kentucky, South Carolina. How do we fare in those games? If we can go in Vandy, but let's take those three. Mm-hmm. If you can go 2-1 versus those teams, you're looking, I think, at that point at a 7-8 win season. Yeah. Depending on how the ball rolls with those other teams.
And I think 7 and 8 wins are something that Florida can hang their hat on. That's growth. That's, Rome wasn't built in a day. I think that when you look at the real internal structural changes that Napier has made and couple that with actual record progress too, I'm comfortable with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, if my calculations are correct, you've got us about an 8-3 record right now, heading into that showdown versus the most overrated team in all of college football, which is Florida State. What are your thoughts?
Talk me into a 9-3 season. What's going on?
I mean, I don't know.
You're going to pick us to beat the national champions?
I mean, this is my thing. They needed help from the refs to beat Florida last year in Tallahassee. And I think Florida is going to be a step better this year. I don't know that I think Florida State is going to be that much improved. I think that they lost some talent last year. I mean, I don't know. They had the Heisman Trophy winner and they'll be playing for a national title. So little old Florida probably has no chance, but I would love the opportunity to play spoiler for them. I personally think they've already dropped games by the time we get to this point. So we were not even going to have the opportunity to play spoiler, but I would love to ruin their season. That would be so fun. It's in the swamp. I've already had so many Florida State fans tell me like, you realize there's going to be more Seminoles in the swamp than Gators that day. I'm like, no, that's not. Do you think all of us are selling our season tickets to Florida State? Fake news. Like, that's not going to happen. No. But I would love you talk to Florida State fans, they think that there is a mile between the two programs right now, which is incredibly laughable.
Look at the recruiting. The recruiting does not back that up, even if we've been down in recruiting.
We've been beating them on the recruiting trail after we had a losing season and they had their best season since 2016. That should tell you something. Oh, but the portal. The portal is great for filling a need here or there, for slapping a bandit on. Like when we had John Grenard in 2019. Yes, great. It works if you have everything else around you and you find a generational quarterback. It wasn't the portal then, but Cam Newton or a Joe Burrow or a Hendon Hooker. Fine, one piece. It doesn't work to fill an entire roster like that. So, all right. One question before we move on, though, to our last piece. This how has our good friend TJ reacted when you've informed him of all these revelations? I know you do a podcast with him.
It is he's my favorite person to argue with because he's just so easy to poke. It's incredibly fun, but he thinks Florida State has a chance to make the playoffs this year. He thinks that the mile is massive between the two programs. He thinks Florida's recruiting class doesn't hold. And so at the end of the year, we're not sitting where we're sitting. I don't think any of those things are true. I think Florida, I'm honestly going to be surprised if Florida loses anyone from this class. And if they do, maybe it's one player or, I don't picture that happening at all. I think that Florida will be very much in it with Florida State. I think it's a coin flip game. I would love for Florida. I mean, Florida could lose another coin flip game earlier in the year if you can tell me that we're going to get Florida State as that coin flip game. The gap there's no gap. And if there is a gap, it's honestly still us with better talent than them, I think. I think they had a nice 10-win season, a nice season. I think that they needed some luck a couple of times. I think had they played LSU later in the season, they would not have a 10-win record last year. But Florida State fans, they
play in the ACC. They play in the ACC,
and that's right. And they're going to stay there for a couple of years because something that their fans have been mysteriously quiet about. But that deadline for them to get out of the league next year came and went. Radio silence from them.
And I think that they overestimate the value that they would bring to this conference. Like Florida State is a national brand. It absolutely is a national brand. The market for the state of Florida, though, we got you covered. I don't know that they bring anything to the table like they think that they do. Now, if everybody's going to expand and the SEC is like, listen, look, we've got to get to 20 teams or we've got to get to 24 or whatever else. I can see where the argument that Florida State makes sense geographically. I can see, okay, well, if we only have the ACC brands to pick from, like, I guess Florida State's the best of the worst or, whatever. But I don't see this like, oh, we're going to expand because Florida State wants to join us. Like that doesn't exist from the SEC. That's only in Florida State's head.
Where a lot of things exist.
Yes.
There's a lot of space in there. A lot of empty space in there.
Well, the games are played for a reason, so we'll have to see how it all turns out. But I do agree. I think we're all in agreement here that we'll probably see our friends up in Tallahassee not get their expectations. Hopefully not. But it's all fun and games. It's good banter. It's what makes our rivalries fun. And hopefully we win our rivalry games this year because last year we were an 0-for, which was highly disappointing.
Yeah.
Unacceptable.
It is. Yeah. It's unacceptable. And that's, at the end of the day, Billy Napier is going to be judged by the wins and losses. And I think that he has all of the intangibles moving in the right direction. And that's great. But the on the field play is going to be what determines whether he's, a Ron Zook who pads our coffers with all of these players and then passes it to the next, or if he's going to be an Urban Meyer or Steve Spurrier who can bring them in and win with them.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. It's been a great conversation, Allie. Definitely loved your insight. I wanted to run my quick synopsis by you because I think we're pretty much in lockstep here for this season. And I've written about this, so I don't need to go into it in too great a detail, but just so we're all on the same page and we can compare each other's thoughts on the same podcast and the same platform. Here's how I see it. Florida's got 2 games that I think are just their losses. Here's me being the pessimist. They're going to be losses. LSU and Georgia. Sorry, I'm just not seeing it. 2 cupcakes baked in there. I know I'd say Georgia Southern. I know USF last year. I know, but Florida should easily win these 2 games against McNeese and Charlotte. So 8 games left. You've got 4 games that you should win. They're not gimmies, but you should beat Arkansas. You should beat Vandy. I think you should beat Tennessee and you should beat FSU because those are your games in the swamp. You've got to show that you can protect your home turf. And that puts you at 6-2. And now you've got 4 games left that I think are the coin flips. I think it's Utah. It's at Kentucky. I hate saying this because I do think that we beat Missouri, but it's a coin flip just because we don't know what the weather's going to be at Missouri. And that leaves us with the 1 game left at South Carolina. So I think Florida goes 2-2 in some permutation in those 4 games. If that's what Florida winds up being, that is 7-5. And that is an improvement from last year. But now my question for you is, if that's how it plays out, you beat Tennessee, you beat FSU. So you can check those, you beat your rival boxes off. But you've lost 2 of those games to Kentucky, Utah, Missouri, and South Carolina. Do you think the fan base as a whole is tolerant of the season and sees it as one that is truly a step in the right direction?
I think the Florida fan base just as well as I do. And the answer to that is probably the seat gets pretty warm if it's 7-5. I not rightfully so, in my opinion. I think that patience, for me, it is absolutely enough to warrant patience. It's a sign of growth. But I think more importantly than even the fan base is the fact that I think that would be growth for the administration. I think that the UF administration understands what the undertaking was here. They wanted the undertaking. You don't get rid of a coach that took you to a New Year's Six Bowl 3 out of 4 years unless you want a completely different direction for the inside of your program. That's a gamble. right? And I mean, we can talk ad nauseum about all the things that were potentially wrong behind closed doors. But from the outside, if you go to 3 out of 4 New Year's Six bowls and you make a change from there, the expectations are high, but you want some sort of complete rebuild. So I think that he gets time from that. But I think all of us, it's part of our responsibility here to urge fans to have patience and to see the growth in ways that are not just measurable by wins and losses, even though at the end of the day, wins and losses are the most important thing.
Well, I'm on record saying that the administration will be very tolerant of him for the reasons you just mentioned. I'm just hopeful that the fans will collectively just band together and give him a chance, because I think you're right. I think he is in here for a few years, and I just hope the fans don't run him off.
Fans love recruiting. Florida is kicking ass. And if you see what they're doing coming off a 6-win season, what is he going to be able to pull off coming off a 10-win season, or even, an 8 or 9-win season? And we want to see the opportunity to see that. He's planting the seeds. We've got to give him time to let the crop grow.
Absolutely. Well, Allie, thank you so much for all of your time and your insights tonight. It's been a fantastic show. Couldn't be more thankful for that. And let the fans know where they can find you. I know you've been putting out a lot of great content out on YouTube, also Twitter. So please let the fans know where they can follow you.
Sure. On Twitter, you can follow me at Ali, which is ALI_peak, PEEK. And then on YouTube, a peek inside Gators football.
Awesome. And please be sure to follow us on the In All Kinds of Weather Forecast on YouTube. Please, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button down there and subscribe. We're going to also continue to put out more content, but great conversation tonight, Allie. Thank you so much. And hopefully we have a great Gator football season that we can continue to talk about.
Yes. Thanks for having me, guys. This was so fun. And, I expect that it's going to be a better year than the experts think.
I think we all agree on that as well. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Go Gators, and we'll see you next time on the In All Kinds of Weather Forecast.
Go Gators.